Welcome to the history of Lithuania. Hello and welcome back to the history of Lithuania. In the previous episode, we talked about a period of Lithuanian history after the death of Mindaugas. We also discussed the rule of numerous unique dukes and ended the episode with the death of Gediminas, one of the most important historic figures in our nation's history. This episode, I'd like to continue by talking about what happened after him. We will be focusing on the unique diarchy of Algirdas and Kęstutis, their fight with Christian holy orders, political intrigue, and of course, once again, the question of Christianization. There's quite a lot of grounds to be covered, as the rule of the dual dukes is well recorded. Before that, I'd like to say that since the last episode, our subscriber count has doubled in size, so thank you all for listening and being patient. Without wasting more time, let us jump in. After the death of Gediminas, he left 7 sons to rule the lands of Lithuania. His youngest, Kęstutis, was the only son that did not get his own, obviously being the youngest. Thus, he was left in the capital city of Vilnius to live at the side of his father. Unfortunately for him, when Gediminas passed away, he unintentionally inherited the capital, which did not sit well with his older brothers. They felt that they shouldn't have to take orders from their much younger and less experienced brother, and thus a plan was devised by Algirdas and Kęstutis. At the time, Algirdas was the ruler of Krėva and Vitebsk, a land in the northern eastern part of current-day Belarus, and Kęstutis, his brother, was a ruler of a long part of western parts of Lithuania, including Trakai. Truthfully speaking, Kęstutis was not a suitable heir to the throne, and his brothers felt that the lands were under a threat of another collapse. With the ever-growing threat of the holy orders, whose attacks have since intensified, a unanimous decision was made that Lithuania needs a strong ruler to help it through a difficult time. Kęstutis was first to act. He quickly occupied the duchy of Vilnius and gave the lands to Algirdas to rule over. You would think that they would have killed Kęstutis for power, but that was not the case at all. He was given a small duchy of Zaslolis just outside Minsk. He was reasonably unhappy about the predicament and even ran away to Moscow to ask for aid. But it was a failed attempt and he had to return to Zaslolis. The general rule of the dukes was quite an enigma, knowing how fierce power struggles could be, but the remaining brothers accepted Algirdas as the ruler of Vilnius and Kęstutis kept the most dangerous parts of Lithuania to defend for himself. Throughout their rule, there were no major conflicts between them and the predicament seemed to work quite well. Kęstutis and Algirdas frequently consulted each other, ruled in relative harmony, and aided their remaining brothers in battle and in statecraft. I said before that it was a diarchy, which is what it looks like, but officially speaking, Algirdas was the Grand Duke of Lithuania, with Kęstutis holding a lot of power. Thus, this interesting and unique way of governing emerged and is written about today. Just like before, Algirdas and Kęstutis had their struggles with the Holy Order. Most of the heavy lifting was done by Kęstutis, who was generally a better military mind. The fighting was conducted in a rather classical medieval way, numerous raids into the territory without a clear goal of capture. I think it is important to once again make the clarification that the raids into Lithuania were most definitely not for the purpose of Christianization, but rather for the purpose of loot. This exact reason was what Gediminas noticed and managed to use it as a leverage against the Holy Knights. When the diarchy of the brothers started, the diplomatic leverage was gone, and thus our Christian neighbors were again free to pretty much raid as much as they like. In fact, by some historic accounts, it is believed that the Teutonic Order had a tradition of inviting knights from all over Europe just for the thrill of the hunt. It was a traditional thing to, quote, wash their swords with pagan blood, end quote. The frequency of the raids was quite intense too. Some accounts claim that the teutons could carry out at least 8 raids per year, while the Livonians did around 2 or 3 raids per year. In comparison, counter-raiding was much harder, only happening around once or twice from the Lithuanian side. It is also important to note that throughout the years a certain war tradition had developed between Lithuania and the Holy Orders, an achievement of Kęstutis. Battles were less of a just mere bloodbath and pillage, but a more traditional fighting experience. There are 3 major dates that I am going to discuss, which is 1348, the Battle of Strėva, 1362, the destruction of Kaunas Castle, and 1370, the Battle of Rudava. First, the Battle of Strėva of 1348. In some sources, it is referred to as one of the greatest defeats of the Grand Duchy. Yet, based on other sources, we can tell that some of the history might be exaggerating the details, as is usually true with retellings of battles. In basic terms, German heralds claimed victory over a force of 18,000 Lithuanians with only 800 soldiers. Some other sources claim that there was a total of 40,000 Lithuanians, with 10,000 losing their life in battle, and so on. While the exact details are very difficult to pinpoint, we can only see the aftermath of the battle. First, a very much so intensified raids into Lithuanian territory, and loss of influence in the Slavic regions. That much we can assume to be true. Some historians also claim that we kind of got lucky that the Teutons also had a rough period and could not take full advantage of the weakened state of the duchy. The second major event, the destruction of Kaunas Castle of 1362. Kaunas Castle was an important marker for Lithuanian defenses alongside Nemunas River. It was the first and the only brick castle that Lithuania possessed. Unfortunately, with a huge influx of knights from all over Europe, the Teutons managed to dig in for a siege, and with the help of various siege mechanisms, took the castle in just a month. Reinforcements from Lithuania also caused the castle to be surrounded and overwhelmed. The aftermath could have been much worse had the Teutons considered occupying Kaunas, but for some reason or the other, they just left. While it did basically open an undefended tunnel deeper into Lithuania for the Holy Order, the castle was rebuilt in 1368 and the gap was once again closed. But it was still a very problematic period for the duchy. And lastly, the Battle of Ruduo of 1370s, which was a culmination of the Lithuanian campaign into Königsberg. There is not much known about the battle itself other than that Lithuanians lost and the raid was failed. There are no reliable sources to tell us what happened exactly, but there are some accounts from around 100 years later. It is not regarded as a great loss, which is a claim that can probably be trusted since the only source came from the Teutons themselves, and they did tend to exaggerate the details. A thing that all these battles have in common is that the Teutons did not fight alone. Various knights from many lands including Italy, England, France, Livonia, and so on. It seems that some of the knights were either veteran who were looking for work as mercenaries, or generally people who enjoyed the thrill of the war, which makes for a fierce opponent for the Lithuanians. It is also important to mention that these three battles claimed the lives of many important people to Lithuania at the time. Narimantas and Manvydas, sons of Gediminas, Vaidotas and Vaishvilas, sons of Kęstutis. The same can be said about the other side, who also lost quite a lot of knights and other important military commanders. After all these events, there was a period of relative peace for around 7 years until the death of Algirdas. But there was still one more raid to Lithuania by Teutons. Some chronicles mention that the raid was unusually big, with around 12,000 Teuton troops entering Lithuania and arriving to Vilnius and Trakai. The reason I mention this is because it is one of the first times that we hear the name Vytautas, who will later become one of the most important people in Lithuanian history. But we will talk about him later. For now, I just like to mention that he, alongside Algirdas, managed to drive the Teutons out using unconventional partisan tactics. And so that was the general vibe of Lithuania and the Holy Order's relationship throughout the rule. Lithuanians did have some major losses and had to pay dearly for it, but it was not the only problems that the nation was dealing with at the time. Next up, I'd like to talk about another very important aspect, the relationship with Poland, which had since deteriorated quite a bit. During the rule of Mindaugas and Gediminas, the relationship between Lithuania and Poland was either neutral or somewhat friendly. At one point, Gediminas even managed to secure a prospering union with Poland to defend against the Teutonic Order. Unfortunately for the diarchy, it changed when a certain Casimir of Poland came into power, who had an ambition for Volhynia, a large region in western Ukraine. It does mark to be one of the earliest instances of Lithuanian-Polish diplomatic relationships, be they negative or positive. During these few decades, general warfare ensued between nations, mostly, once again, due to a land dispute. King Casimir noticed that the Holy Order managed to secure some decent support from the west so that they could continue their fight against the pagan Lithuanians, and he seemed to also be quite interested in the ordeal. But Casimir was a smart fella, so not only did he call for crusades against Lithuania, but he also called for the Christianization to put a wrench in the Holy Order's plans. By now, it should be obvious that the German orders had no intention of spreading Christianity to Lithuania. It was more all about the endless looting and pillaging that they could do in the lands. At one point, the Pope promised to crown Kęstutis if he accepted to be baptized, and for a time, he accepted. But it was only a farce to get a momentary lapse of peace for the Lithuanians, so they could retaliate against the invading Polish. It worked, but not without consequence. After the very short truce, Kęstutis rallied his armies and managed to drive out the Polish forces out of Volhynia, and the battles continued. King Casimir did not give up, and even managed to involve both the Pope and the Emperor into the whole ordeal. This finally convinced Algirdas and Kęstutis to start an effort of accepting Christianity, and so Charles sent a delegation to Lithuania to begin. For the dismay of the Emperor and the Teutons, Lithuanians pulled a classic move of unreasonable demands, which included for the order to abandon all occupied lands, leave any lands that had majority of native Lithuanians, move to Russia to defend Europe from the ongoing Tartar invasions, and of course seize all advances made on Lithuanian lands. Obviously it was not possible, because that would basically mean a dissolution of the entirety of the Teutons, which were, at the time, a huge power, and a quite successful one too. It would also mean to give up a large part of the empire for the emperor, which seemed too unreasonable to be made possible. And so the efforts for Christianization ceased completely. The question was not raised again for the rest of the brothers' reign. During the reign of the brothers, the formula for the rule was quite simple. Kęstutis was left to deal with Poland and the Holy Orders, while Algirdas took upon himself to subdue Russia and current-day Ukraine into his rule. It is important to note that the Principality of Moscow at this point was already a rather large unit and was on a conquest for smaller duchies around it. Algirdas seems to have somewhat struggled to keep them at bay, so for some time he focused himself solely on Kiev. The biggest problem for him were the Tartars, which he successfully defeated on several occasions to take complete control of Kievan land. After dealing with Kiev, he once again laid his eyes on Moscow and managed to secure a marriage with the Duchess of Tver. The city of Tver is historically important because before Moscow became what it is today, Tver stood in its place. Algirdas had huge ambitions and a lot of success on his conquest in Russia. During his reign, he managed to secure many duchies in Russia, including Smolensk, and a lot of lands along the Dnieper River. You might wonder, just how successful was Algirdas? Well, according to some papers, Lithuanian lands had the size of around 350,000 square kilometers at the time of Gediminas' death in 3041. Comparing that to Algirdas, that had quite literally doubled in size to 700,000 square kilometers in 3077. This did come with a rather big problem, which was that even though the conquest was successful, the general population of Lithuania dropped significantly too, from 53% to only 30%. This will unfortunately be a bit of an issue in the future, but we will also discuss that only in future episodes. While Algirdas did try his best to secure a sphere of influence in Moscow throughout his reign, he did not manage to do so completely. After the Treaty of Lubutsk, Algirdas promised to not interfere in the relationships between Tver and Moscow anymore, and his eyes once again shifted towards Ukrainian lands. His ambition of being the great ruler of Russia ended with that treaty too. Some other details about Algirdas is that he was keen on giving Russian lands away to his own sons, of which he had 12, quite a number for the time. Most of them did become Russified, a natural consequence of ruling Russian lands. Their children, grandsons of Algirdas, most likely grew up Russian. Algirdas died in 3077, at the age of 81, having doubled Lithuania in size. He was buried with proper pagan tradition. He was burnt alongside 18 horses and numerous other items, including gold, pearls, gemstone-encrusted clothing, and so on. He left a big and powerful land for his sons, one of whom, Jogaila, is also to become the king of Poland. Algirdas' dying wish was that his son Jogaila would take the reign of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and continue his father's legacy. He fully expected him to keep a friendly relationship with Kęstutis and Vytautas, Vytautas being the son of Kęstutis, with whom he was a friend from a young age. But it was hardly the case. Both Vytautas and Jogaila saw that the fights with the Teutons were futile. The fighting had somewhat exhausted the nation economically, and he was very much willing to go through a truce at whatever the cost. Not to mention that at that point Teutons had taken over Lithuanian access to the Baltic Sea, which was also a very painful economic consequence. Jogaila was not the oldest son of Algirdas, thus in the good old Medieval fashion, his brothers organized a coalition against him with the support of Moscow, who saw that they might benefit by taking over some Lithuanian lands. So in turn, he sided with the Tartars. Unfortunately, Moscow managed to beat them, and Jogaila was once again left to fend for himself against the ever-growing coalition, which will continue to threaten him for some time. In the years 1379-1380, Jogaila and Kęstutis put a lot of effort into stopping the advances of the Teutonic Order, who still ravaged the Lithuanian lands. In 1379, a treaty was signed that should have oversaw that the Teutons stopped attacking northwestern parts, but the treaty did not foresee what would happen in the north, Livonian side, thus it did not really amount to anything, and the fighting continued. Another very important part was that in this treaty, Samogitian lands were excluded, thus while the order generally avoided Lithuanian lands, the Samogitians were still fair game. A year later, Jogaila signed another treaty with the entirety of the Holy Orders, but this time Kęstutis was excluded on purpose. The treaty oversaw that Jogaila would become a personal ally of the order, even against his own uncle. It was obvious that their relationship was very much strained, and the order saw that as an advantage to eventually completely remove Kęstutis out of the picture. And so exactly that happened. A year later, the information about the secret treaty came to Kęstutis, most likely purposefully leaked to the Duke. It seemed that the Holy Orders needed an inner conflict in Lithuania so that they could take advantage of it. After Kęstutis heard of the betrayal, he almost immediately went after Vilnius, that was ruled by Jogaila. Because Jogaila's armies were sent away to Polok, the castle fell quite quickly. He arrested the entire family of Jogaila, found the treaty as proof, and took away his right to the throne. Unfortunately, Vytautas sided with Jogaila, and Kęstutis was forced to release him. For the time being, Kęstutis had the support of most of the nobility and the armies, thus Jogaila was left pretty much barefoot in the situation. He immediately began fights with the Holy Order once again. Some internal uprisings also had to be put down, but Jogaila didn't disappear so easily. Due to his intentions of peace with the Germans, he had the utmost support of the Teutons, especially the ones who resided in Vilnius, and while Kęstutis was away having to deal with the turmoil, Jogaila once again started scheming. He managed to secure the city of Vilnius into his hands once again. While at it, Jogaila also managed to take Trakai, another huge duchy in Lithuania. After the dramatic events, Vytautas immediately informed his father of the current affairs, and once again, Kęstutis mustered his armies to go and take away Vilnius away from Jogaila. After arriving at Trakai, Jogaila invited Kęstutis and Vytautas for negotiations to Vilnius. After their arrival, they were both immediately arrested. Kęstutis was then brought to Krėvos castle, and according to historic accounts, after 5 days of imprisonment, he was strangled to death by Jogaila's servants, thus ending his reign of 45 years in 1382. Kęstutis was killed at the age of 85 and left behind 9 children, including Vytautas, the future Grand Duke of Lithuania. It is of course a very unfortunate end for a great ruler. Historians disagree on how much Jogaila had to do with the death of Kęstutis. It is generally believed that it was Kirgaila, a younger brother of Jogaila, who acted on his brother's behalf, as he was the first one and the only one to have found his uncle dead. Kęstutis was brought back to Vilnius for a pagan burial. He was burnt, much like his brother, with most of his possessions. The death of Kęstutis marks the end of an old era of Lithuanian history and gives way to the beginning of huge change. After his death, Jogaila completely overtook the reins of Lithuania and shifted his ambition for Poland, and quite successfully too. But it was a time of great turmoil too, especially between him and Vytautas, who oversaw the legacy of Lithuania to the best of his abilities. But that is it for our great brothers. I will have to continue in the next episode, as the topic of Vytautas and Jogaila are both very complex and quite large. To summarize the rule of Kęstutis and Algirdas, it was a time of great expansion for Lithuania, and no other ruler oversaw a larger addition to the Grand Duchy as Algirdas. The diarchy worked great for a few reasons. First of all, Kęstutis and Algirdas knew their role very well and acted upon them without huge ambitions for each other's lands. I would say that it is a rare example of two rulers getting on very well by knowing what they need to do and what they shouldn't. Kęstutis oversaw the Teutons and the Poles, while Algirdas kept his eyes on the Tartars and the Ukrainians and Russians. Lithuania was a very quickly expanding nation, and there was simply no reason for the brothers to have disputes over land. Algirdas quite literally couldn't handle just how much land he was conquering and had to divert his attentions often and a lot. Most importantly, they very much agreed on the fact that pagan Lithuania land must be protected from the holy orders, and both generally did not get into too much diplomacy with them, which did not push them towards alliances against each other. Finally, as brothers, they seemed to have an unbreakable agreement of what belongs to whom and had different goals and ambitions that carried them from the entirety of their lives. I hope that you found their lives as interesting as I did, and in the next episode we will be talking about Vytautas and Jogaila, the next generation of Lithuania who oversaw great changes both to the duchy and to the people. And that's it for today, and I encourage you to follow us on Instagram. I try to upload updates about the channel, especially when I am absent for a long period of time. You can also connect with me there. I have made promises in the past about the timing of episodes, which have not necessarily been fulfilled. Thus, I will try to be more precise next time. I have an ambition for the channel to continue until we finish this series, or at least cover the most important bits and pieces of Lithuanian history. As always, you can leave your questions or feedback under this episode or on Instagram. I would also greatly appreciate it if you rated the podcast on Spotify, as it helps me reaching more people. As always, thank you for listening, and I hope you join me next time.